So today we want to explore the idea that relationships move us. And when we are moved, the tie that binds begins to get stronger. Now, I think that most of us could think of times when we've been moved by something or someone, right? And it is a very visceral response, isn't it? I mean, sometimes those experiences move us forward and sometimes they move us back, right? All of us have been in relationships where we were moved perhaps a little backwards before we were moved forward. But it's a very visceral feeling to be moved by something. Think about that. Some of you may have goosebumps when you're moved. Some of you might cry when you're moved. Some of you might get a lump in your throat where it's hard to speak when you're moved. But we all know our telltale signs, right, of when we are moved. Sometimes we're moved by loss and pain, and those same visceral responses will come to mind. What I'm certain of is that when we are moved by someone, when we are moved in relationship with each other, then we are never the same from that moment. What I'm wondering about for us today is this piece of scripture in the book of Galatians, a letter to the church at Galatia, where it is being explained what it means to walk with the Spirit. Now, there's a long string of things there. Donna aptly noticed that one of them was listed twice, which was goodness. I think that was a printing error, but maybe not a bad one, right? So goodness and kindness, and forbearance, there's a whole list of things about what it looks like to walk with the Spirit. If we were to hone in on some of those things, we would probably discover that all of them require us to be moved in some way. But what I want to focus on most from that scripture is the last sentence. Live by the Spirit and keep in step with the Spirit. Live by the Spirit and keep in step by the Spirit. Now, a lot of times when we white people start trying to clap and sing, we get out of step with the Spirit. This might be a starting place for us in our relationship with those who seem to find that step a little easier than we do. Staying in step with the Spirit. It is actually more than a notion to do that. And so today, as a way of trying to exemplify that, I want to not so much preach, to be honest, but to share. And to share my own story about what it looks like to try to untangle this thing we call racism. And what does it look like as Christians, white Christians, grapple with how we are going to engage ourselves with our own sense, our own sometimes unconscious bias and racism. I want to share my story by telling you that I was born in 1956. So not to strain any of your brains trying to figure out how old I am. I'm 63, so we're done with that, all right? So I was born in 1956. Do you know that 2 years prior to my birth is when Brown versus the Board of Education was settled, that said there should not be segregation in the schools, that it was unconstitutional for there to be segregated schools in this country. I was born in 2 years later. Do you know that I was born in South Alabama? Sometimes I say I was born in LA, Lower Alabama. And I lived most of my growing up years in the state of Alabama. Do you know that it was a full 15 years after Brown versus the Board of Education before the schools where I lived integrated in South Alabama? 15 years after it was made law. That's pretty wild, isn't it? So in my growing up years, I lived in a very small town in South Alabama called Georgiana. Prior to that, I had lived in Mississippi. My dad was a Baptist preacher, and so we moved around some. Do you know that from the time I was about 4 until I was about 14, we had a maid? Now, we were a lower middle class family. But it was easy to have a black maid. You know why? Because I'm sure we paid them nothing much. Now, I'm not saying I'm proud of any of this, but I want you to hear this story. I want you to hear the depth of this, that it is in me, and I don't like that much, but I know it is true. Beulah was my first maid because she also cared for me and took care of me. And she's the one who taught me how to tie my shoes. She's the one that I remember first giving me turnip greens, which I love. And then a little later in my life, Miss Ethel was our maid. And Miss Ethel is the one who taught me how to iron and how to fold my clothes. Ask Kate, I'm still pretty good at folding my clothes. Now, there's some sweetness in that. There's a sweet story there, but there's a lot wrong with it too. And so when I was 14 years old, our schools finally integrated in South Alabama. The summer before the integration was going to happen in the fall, in our county of only our county, not our city, our county of only 20,000 people, that summer 3 private schools shot up all of a sudden in that small little county, so all the white kids could go to a private school and not have to go to the public school with the black kids. Do you know that my parents, I have no idea where they got this or how they came out this way, because they grew up in South Alabama too. But they put their foot down with me and said, "You're not going to a private school. You're going to stay in the public school, and you're going to get to know these people who live right here around us." Now, I was 14. I didn't want my friends to go somewhere without me, right? That meant everything to me when I was 14, but my parents said no. And so I got to experience when 4 black kids came to our school that year. Bless their hearts. 4. That was a hard year for them. I remember that succinctly. But you know who got focused on was how hard it was on the white kids. You know, we had some uprising, we had some riots, we had some problems with people with weapons, children with weapons, basically, in the school. But do you know that my dad would bring me to school every morning, and he would sit outside the school in the car, but he refused to take me home just because things were hard. He was encouraging me, "If you need me, I'm right here, but stay there. Stay there and help work this through." Ujima, what we talked about earlier in the prayer time. You stay with each other and you see the problems that you have with your brothers and sisters, and you work them out together, not apart. So this was pretty stark for me when I was in high school, to sort of be one of the few kids. I didn't have many friends anymore who were still going to the school that I attended. But you know what? I was moved by that experience. I was moved then as a 14-year-old, but as life has gone on, I've been moved by that reality over and over and over again. That my parents had the wisdom in South Alabama in the 60s to keep me in the public school. Somebody say amen, for heaven's sake. That's just unbelievable that that really happened. Unfortunately, as I graduated from high school and went to college, I spent about another 18 years in a very white world. There are days when I wish I could get that back. But the truth is, I went to a very white university. I took up very white jobs. I sort of took up this, I'm not proud of this either, but this whole pick me up by the bootstraps kind of idea about life. Like anybody can be whatever they want to be in this great America. Until later, I discovered that not everybody can be whatever they want to be because they're not given the same opportunities and they're not given the same chance. But I had that for a long while. And then, in 1992, I just started a new business, and my business partner and I moved to Washington, D.C. Now, we moved from Dallas, Texas to Washington, D.C. D.C. is predominantly black in population and demographic. So I was living in a city that was predominantly black, and then I also started attending MCC in Washington, D.C. that was about 40% black. Now, in MCC, that was unheard of, that almost half of the congregation would be African American. So I was starting to have this very interesting experience, both in the city where I lived and the church that I attended. When I first started going to church there, I was just so taken by this choir that would sing twice a month. It was a predominantly black gospel choir with some sprinkling of white people in it. And Candy Holmes and David North, a black woman and a black man, were the directors of this choir. And I began every time they sang to be profoundly moved. Profoundly moved. I couldn't even figure out why exactly. But I knew that there was something that was happening in my soul in the listening of that music that had never happened to me before. As a little bit of time went by, I searched Candy out to say, can white people sing in this choir? And she's like, absolutely, come on, we've got a few, you come on. So I started going to rehearsals and I started singing in that choir. And to date, it's probably one of three things that have been most profound in my own spiritual formation, was singing in that choir. Now this was a church of about 250 people. This choir was about 40. Do you know that over a couple of year period, that choir sang for Janet Reno, the Attorney General, sang for Bill Clinton in the White House, backed up Shaka Khan at her concert? What? All of a sudden, this choir got all of this notoriety and had all of these opportunities to sing on behalf of the church. And I started to realize that there was something extraordinary about how black people sing. And one night, before we started rehearsal, Candy said to us, you know, the song in us comes from being the descendants of slaves who stood in the fields and despite being whipped and tortured and raped and thought only as property, in spite of that, sang the great spirituals. Sang, God, we know that you will free us, even in the midst of being anything but free. And I had a moment in that conversation where I was profoundly moved that is the sound we hear. It's the sound that you cannot find anywhere else. It's the sound of a black gospel choir singing from their descendants, singing from that place of believing that God would free them someday, even as they were anything but free. Do you hear me? If we can be moved by that understanding, we can solve problems together. We can see each other. We can know we are different and still find a way to let both things exist. I was moved. I told Candy, many of you know Reverend Candy Holmes now. When I first asked about the choir, I was like, I don't think I would have known you if I met you coming down the street, face on, because I've only ever seen your backside. But I was so fascinated by the animation of her directing. And so I was completely moved by it. Then in 1993, I had my first opportunity to go to South Africa. Fortunately, I had this gospel choir thing under my belt a little bit, and so I was able to hear the singing of African natives. And I heard the same voice. I heard that same resonance in their belly, believing that God would free them even though they were anything but free, because that was before apartheid was over. In 1995, unfortunately, I had to witness in the church, MCC MCC DC, racism play out. Because as that choir got more exposure and had more success, the white folks in the congregation started to not like that very much. It was the saddest thing. And I know all of us shake our heads and go, oh, that's... But you know, none of us are necessarily going to avoid some of that. If we were put in the same exact situation, we have to ask ourselves, how would we be as white people? And so had to sort of stand by and watch that all play out. I'm not going to go into that more deeply right now, but I do hope that someday we'll have a chance to talk about it, because it has formed at least how I view the way that white people in white churches end up interacting, or not so well, with our African American siblings. And then in 2000, I was ordained MCC as clergy person. And I was serving in a church in Dallas, the Cathedral of Hope, a 2,000-member church. And I asked Candy to come and direct the choir at the Cathedral of Hope for my ordination. So she comes on Thursday night to choir rehearsal. She had sent the music ahead. And I went to choir rehearsal with her because I just wanted to watch what was going to happen. So we basically had a lot of uppity musicians in this choir, okay? And very proper. And so she went through the song with them a couple of times, and then she said, okay, put your books down, because we're singing an African-American black gospel number, put your books down. Well, you would have thought she had slit their throat or something. I mean, there was this just nastiness that was just pouring out of them about, woo, we don't sing without the books, we have to follow the notes and get it just right. And they just weren't going to have it. But she was just very patient and just kept saying, let's just try it once. You have never heard a sound like she got out of that choir. Once they put their books down and they got in step with the Spirit, instead of just in step with a piece of music, it was an entirely different experience. They rocked that cathedral that morning that was 2,000 people full, and they were on their feet and had no idea why. You know why? Because the choir was in step with the Spirit, and you cannot combat that when it happens. Because the Spirit is more powerful than we are, except when we shut down and we don't take it in. So, unfortunately, a lot of white churches are dying. You know that, right? And I think in large part it's because we have shut down. We have quit feeling the Spirit and the things that are important about being in relationship with God and with each other. Then in 2013, I moved to St. Louis, another city that is predominantly black. The first year I was there is when Michael Brown was murdered. Remember that? In Ferguson, Missouri. And then we have all the uprising with the police there. Our congregation there rented out some of our space to a black gay Pentecostal group. Now that's a bunch of stuff right there. So you would think that since we cohabited the same facility, that there would have been some cross-pollination of some sort, but it was fascinating how on both sides we remained very segregated. And what I would hear on Sundays when our church service was over and we were out in the lobby and the black church started their service were all of these derogatory comments about the black church. Now, what's the point in that? That's our racism, white folks. It's somehow that we can pass judgment on the ways that a different group of people come and worship. And so it's important for us to understand that we have to stop that. And instead say, what would it be like if I engaged that kind of worship once? Wonder what would happen to me. You know what happened to me back in D.C.? You've heard this story before, some of you. Is that I had to learn how to clap, sway, and sing at the same time. And as I was learning, I would discover that I was clapping and singing but not swaying, or I was clapping and swaying but not singing. I just couldn't get all three happening at once. And Donna, who sat next to me in the alto section, finally one day, she's like, we're going to have to get Velcro on your robe and stick it to us so that you're headed in the right direction. And then she finally decided to sit down and talk to me and say, Lily, you're trying too hard. Because the real secret here is that you just have to let the Spirit move you. You don't have to count and think and all of that. Leave that alone. But I was a white thinking person, trying to get it right. And I was missing the very way that I would get it right. I learned a big lesson in that. And then in St. Louis, I saw how we got so separated and how it became this fight over whether Black Lives Matter or Blue Lives Matter, the police, or whether all lives matter, into this crazy conversation about that. You've had them, haven't you? And so what's important about Black Lives Matter is that if you are a firefighter, you go to the house on the block that's burning, not the ones that aren't. That's why Black Lives Matter, is because sometimes their houses are burning. Their lives are burning. There's things that aren't fair, and it's burning. And so white people, these are our opportunities to engage in real relationship, things that move us along the way. There's so many things I could say, but there are just a few quick little things I want to ask you to work on. And I'm asking you to work on them because I've heard some of you say these things. And are you willing to work on it a little? Just to get started. For Black people, it is not helpful when you say, well, I have a lot of friends who are Black. Or my best friend is Black. As though that means you understand all Black people. Or that you have deeply engaged in conversation with a Black person. Or that you know their history. Or you know their traditions. You know their stories. Just because you have friends who are Black does not mean any of those other things I just said. You hear me? So pay attention to that. Or we get all puffed up as white people and say, I don't see color. I don't see color. We're all the same. No, we're not. Being Black matters to people who are Black because it means something. It means something about their culture and their traditions and their stories and their families. They are not like our skin. For those of us who are white. You hear that? Let's not whitewash everybody, okay? Colors are important, and every color is a piece of the face of God. And that's what it means to be in step with the Spirit. And then there's this, well, we want Black people to come to our church. Of course we do. Now, what follows right after that? But we don't want them to get too wound up. I mean, we don't really want to worship like they do, but oh boy, we really would like Black people to come to our church. Wouldn't that be great? We're open, we're inclusive. Are we? I was amused at my installation, which has been not quite a year ago, in this church. And Reverend Candy came to preach as part of, I invited her for my installation. And I don't know if those of you who were here remember when she got up to preach, she started by singing a song. It was just a little chorus, but I'd never heard it. And later, when I was watching the video of the installation, and the camera had it from the back, so I could see, people's backsides. What I noticed was when she asked us to start singing a chorus we had never heard and didn't know the words to, and they were not on the screen, that we were all singing, get this, singing and clapping in perfect rhythm, and singing a song we had never heard and did not know the words to, and we were singing it perfectly. And then I started to notice it was like a wave. People were on their feet. And I saw some of you look back like, how did I get into a standing position? No idea how I got into a standing position. Well, here's how. That's what it looks like to be in step with the Spirit when it just happens because the Spirit moves through. So I want us to stop stopping the Spirit. And however that comes to us, it's going to come through some white people. It's certainly going to come through some black people. Next week's a good chance for us to practice. It's going to come through people of other colors, people of other ethnicities. It's going to come to us through the chants of Native Americans. It's going to come to us, and the Spirit will come through, but we have to be open. It has to be on us to be open. In 2015, when the massacre in a black church happened in Charleston, South Carolina, just a couple of weeks after it happened, I went to Charleston. And I visited the church and all of the memorials that went on for blocks around the church. And when I got on the plane that afternoon to go back to St. Louis, I wrote a prayer. And I would like for us to end this message with that prayer. And I would like you not to clap when this is over, because I want you to feel this. I want you to sense what it means to be moved, even in the face of tragedy. The streets of Charleston were busy and the pavement hot on Sunday afternoon. There were horns and cars and chatter that filled the air. As I moved toward the barricade that framed the Mother Emanuel AME Church, with every step, the hush of the crowd and the silence that fell over us was more and more pronounced. By the time I made my way to the center of the memorial that has been growing every day since the murders, there was a haunting silence, as though there was no sound that existed within 50 miles. There were flowers and notes hung on the gate, and crosses and signatures and candles and tears. I was overtaken by what I can only describe as a sweet haunting. I was overwhelmed with a profound sense of loss and felt the bone-chilling effects of a haunting hatred. Even so, those feelings were quickly followed by the sweet swirling of grace and forgiveness. It was as if those whose lives had been taken from this earthly plane were still with us as witnesses to both the horror of hate and the sweetness of forgiveness. I knelt and prayed, barely noticing the heat that seared through to my knees from the burning concrete. Something would not let me hang my head in prayer, but rather nudged me to hold my head up and see the place where hate did not have the last word. This, the oldest African Methodist Episcopal Church in the South, held its head high through the spires of its structure and the grace of its people. With my head held up, I knew I was surrounded by the deep and unwavering faith of black lives who have known the pain of slavery and hate and exclusion, and yet have kept a faith in God that we should all envy. With my held head up, I was suddenly clear that black lives matter for many reasons, but especially because they bring to all our lives the deep waters of faith and hope that privilege and power never, ever reveal. It was hard to leave that place. There was something there that would not let me go. I may never know or understand that force, but this I do know. If we can learn to live in the sweet haunting, then we will know the way toward healing racism, hatred, and violence. May we never wish the haunting to leave us, for it provides us with a reminder that power and privilege and senseless violence are ever present all around us. Equally, may we never fail to give ourselves to the sweetness of grace, forgiveness, and healing. A sweetness given by the greater cloud of witnesses, and a sweetness that we can choose to embody in our own lives. Oh God, may the sweet haunting be so. Amen.